Okay, number 3. I hope this is landing for you. I would love to have some feedback. There's a utility within this app for you to send me a message. They're short. I think you get a 10-second burst. But is this landing? Is this creating inquiry? Is it opening up some novel spaces in the brain? There's a lot of little pieces of my story that have become really rich fuel for change for me. And I'm hoping that by sharing the stories that come through me and to me in this lifetime, that I may be offering some possibilities to you. So I welcome your feedback. So far I've landed a few ideas here. Early on, I talked about the 90-10 rule, that it only takes 10% of our effort to get 90% of the way home in this human experience, where we find this place of grace and peace. And I just want to spend a few minutes on this little element of that grace and peace, because it took me many, many years, but to reach that. But beyond that, this next 10%, where it takes 90% of the effort to make our way home, that's the part I'm in now. And it felt like the work I did before was monumental, and the work I'm doing now is the big work of showing up for myself every day, right? So death is a really interesting place to hang out around. My own near-death experience, as it turns out, I've had 3 of them in this lifetime. You know, if we step into the big ideas of what happens before we get here on this human plane and after we leave, I call those my big toe, my big theory of everything. And part of my big toe is that I was informed by my near-death experience that we come from a field of pure love and light, and there's no fear, no judgment, and there's no heaven or hell, and that we return to that, and that we have in this human experience the opportunity to expand into love in a physical form. Like when you are love, the experience of expanding into it in a physical form is new and novel. It's an experience, right? And when I had that near-death experience, it was just all love and light and beautiful, but there was no learning, no growth, no expansion of soul. So near-death experiences, I think I must have signed up for multiples because I'm a slow learner. One time I had a medicine reaction. I had anaphylaxis and got right down to the screech of gonna die, and not quite. That was interesting, and I was kind of numbed out by the whole thing. It took me weeks to recognize what had happened and how it had impacted me. Like I would spend a lot of my life pretty numb, and it's taken these last couple of years to really let my body have a full experience and not numb out with food or, name your addictive distraction, whatever it is. If it's food, it's alcohol, it's drugs, it's sex, it's porn, and I'll talk about addictions later on. But those near-death experiences, the veil gets very thin. And there's a beautiful book called Die Wise by Stephen Jenkinson, and he's a palliative care person who goes around, and they call him Dr. Death, I think, and it's kind of a harsh term, but he's the one that they call when the family has a loved one on life support for no reason but their own grief and sadness. And it's time to pull the plug. It's time to let life run its course. It's time to release the human form. And he's the one that brings people to the yes for that experience. And he says that when you are near death, it's the most honest, truthful place to be. There's no sort of, how do I look in this moment? There's no vanity. There's no identity. That you want to know somebody, know them at their deathbed. And so I did with my mom. My mom and I had had a pretty rough and rocky life. She either lived with me or next door to me most of my life. And so the codependency was strong. It was pretty intense between us. But in the final years, my life's path was lining up in such a way that my level of consciousness, I was able to meet her at her level of consciousness, and we could make some peace with each other. She was a nurse. She was actually, came by that very honestly. She was born with a dislocated hip back in the 30s, and in those days, they put young kids in body casts, and she was in and out of the hospital, Shriners Hospital, until she was about 18 months old in a body cast. Now, previous sessions I've talked about babies need connection, and they fail to thrive without physical connection. And so for my mom, her entire orientation to her life and her body was through a medical lens. And if you know the term Munchausen's by proxy, you'll recognize a lighter version of it in my story. My mom did not make me sick, but anything that was happening with my body became a monumental thing. And as a hospital administrator, she had access to the latest, greatest treatments. And so I was subjected to a lot of experimental stuff that today's medicine we would look at and go, how barbaric that they, irradiated your thyroid at 11 and set me on a course of hypothyroidism. And so all of that to say, my mom and I had some hard edges to work through. But towards the end of her life, we worked through them. We got through some really hard stuff. And the last few days of her life, her liver was failing, and not from alcohol, but from too much Tylenol. Because of her hip, she had a lot of pain. And in those days, they didn't really understand that even over-the-counter stuff had the potential for harm. We're going to look at today's medical establishment 20 years from now and think, what were we thinking, right? So we're learning, getting better at this. But unfortunately, her body suffered a lot of damage along the way. And so the last several years of her life had been really hard. And finally, her liver was failing. And she was in hepatic failure, meaning the kidneys, the liver, everything was shutting down. And I was her medical durable power of attorney. And I had 3 brothers, and 2 of them had died early. That's a whole other story. And my 3rd brother, bless him, neurospicy human that he is, he wasn't always as plugged in. So pretty much the weight of Mom's well-being had always been on my shoulders. And so the mother-daughter wound was heavy. And I didn't want her to go to her grave, or me not to be able to have this clearing with her. So in her final days, when we knew that we were coming to, the final stages of her life, we talked a lot about the things between us. And I said, Mom, if you get to the other side and there's some way to let me know that you made it okay, please, just let me know. And it's tongue-in-cheek, but I even with all my religious orientation and all of the sort of near-death experience reinforcing that there is something beyond this life, I still until we're on the other side, and maybe we'll all get to the other side and go, oh, that was so good. What did we learn? Let's go do it again, right? Like, maybe we really did choose this experience, and maybe I really did choose her. That's a hard one, right? And so I'd been in the hospital for 17 days by her bedside, this final round. We'd been in and out of hospitals for years, and but this was it. This was the final round. And I said, Mom, let me know, right? So I was exhausted, and the morphine drip had been started, and we were 2 days into the final descent. And I wanted to go home, take a shower, take a nap, and come back. And about 4:30 in the morning, I got a call and said, come now, it's time. And I got back to the hospital, and I became completely disoriented at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I couldn't park the car. And I actually backed into a pole. I still have the dent in my little Subaru. And I looked at the clock, and the time was the exact time she passed. And I had had a similar experience when my grandmother passed. I was driving, and I had to pull over the car because I couldn't cognitively process how to keep the car moving forward in a safe way. And this was happening again to me. So death, the veil gets very thin, and there's the rules of reason don't apply anymore. And so I got to her room, and indeed she had passed. And I'd only been gone a couple of hours, and the nurse had even said it might be another day, so you can go home, take a shower, have a nap, come back. But I missed the window. And anybody who does palliative care or doula work, death doula work, will tell you that sometimes that's when they go. They let go when there's nobody in the room. And so she had let go. And I said my goodbyes, and I confirmed the final wishes for her to be able to be cremated, that the Neptune Society was going to come pick her up in the morgue, and then I drove home. And that's a 2.5 hour drive, and I came home, and I had a little bit of cannabis on board, and laid on my back porch on the hammock and just wept and wept, and been holding it in a long time. And this gorgeous wave of grace washed over me, this recognition that she had worked her whole life to be a good person and do the right thing. And even the really hard Munchausen's by proxy stuff that had happened between us, she was doing what she understood to be the right thing. And I could look at her entire life story and recognize that her mom was not a very physically nurturing person. So no wonder nursing and medical stuff became a love language for her. And so I got that, and I thought, well, then it was grandma's fault or grandpa's fault. And I thought, no, grandma grew up on a farm in North Dakota and lived a really kind of hard, disconnected life. So grandma's not to blame. And grandpa, he grew up an Irish Catholic, lot of alcohol, lot of, the typical family alcoholic syndrome stuff so it wasn't his fault. And so how far back do you go to find the bad guy? How far back do you go to find the culprit, the one who's responsible for everything that happened? And the further back you go, the more diluted it becomes. And you just recognize, heck, my grandparents grew up in the middle of a world war and a depression, and their parents grew up in a war. And all of a sudden you recognize that there is just this generational accumulation of unconsciousness, of grief, of sorrow, unmet wounding, passed on generation into projection and gamesmanship and blame and shame, and so you kind of meet this Garden of Gethsemane moment of reality where, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. This moment of grace for the entire human story, that when we know better, we do better. That's all consciousness is closing the gap between knowing better and doing better. And anything that gets in the way of that is the work, right? Anything, any place where we stay stuck on who to blame, or we loop around the why. Why did my father do what he did? And then I had a measure of grace for him too, because I recognized what had been done to him as a small child, and abandoned early by his father. His mother died when a young boy, and he was raised in a very misogynistic, crass, patriarchal orientation. But once upon a time, he was an innocent child too. So again, how far back do you go? It doesn't take a big leap of imagination to understand that our parents were the product of their set and setting of life, and so on and so on and so on. So you can spend your whole life looping around, why did this happen to me? Or you can make this shift, and it's on its surface subtle, but when it lands, it is life-changing. And it's the difference between life is happening to us versus life is happening for us. And when I made that shift from victim to student, grace brought more ease of beingness. That you take malice out of the equation, you substitute in unconsciousness, and you recognize that your past doesn't have to be your future. You can move from victim of your story, from your woundology, to student of your story, to your mythology. So that path from woundology to mythology. So I'm stepping into my mythology as I tell you this story. So Mom passed away just as I'm backing my car into a pole. I get home, I get this beautiful wash of grace, and I get this hit that I should record it. Like I've never recorded anything before, but this I wanted to hold this truth past that moment. It was that important to me. So I'm having big tears, snotty mess, grateful that she's at peace, and also that I wrote a poem, my mother mortgage was paid in full, and that I owned myself free and clear. I really did feel that for the first time in my life. The codependency between us was done. And so I was just laying there, letting this soften my nervous system, releasing her, releasing, and releasing my own body, my own medical trauma that I had endured so many layers of over the decades of my life. And all of a sudden I think about it now, and it feels like she got to the other side. She flipped a switch, and this beautiful languaging, some would call it a channel, some would call it inspired thought, creative flow, whatever language you use to describe those moments where you have a knowing that's greater than the sum of your experiences. You just know. And these words began to flow in that space of knowing. This was 2014, July 17, coming up on 9 years since Mom passed. This channel opened, and these were the words: that we were coming into a time where truth had become lies and lies would become truth. And that it was in service. Life is happening for us, not to us. It was in service to helping us reattune to our inner guidance systems, to not put our trust in what others say, but to feel through our nervous systems what is true and what is not. So So that was like lies become truth, truth become lies. It's in service to helping us realign with our inner guidance systems, our nervous systems, our electrical field point of consciousness meeting spirit and matter in the same place and time. And I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. And I was like, okay, so how do you navigate to truth? And it's back to that nervous system calibration to make sure that all my choices are calibrated to my nervous system, to the ease of my beingness. And we've discovered now that we not only have brain cells up here, but we have them in our heart and in our gut too. And so it's like lining all three of those wisdom centers up. The nervous system is the thing that connects them all. The spine connects them all. Sometimes when I'm in this full channel space, my entire spine just feels like it's open to the universe. And so this alignment of all the wisdom centers is the target condition for higher states of consciousness. And so that was a beautiful thing, that it was in service to helping us re-engage with that, and that it would be the storytellers that would bring us home. And I sat with that and I thought, why what about storytellers? And it's because it's not it's a resonant place when I tell my story and you tell your story, and when we hear other people's stories, and it holds us, it meets us in some place inside of us, some knowing place inside of us, that the storytellers will navigate past the lies, past the falsehoods, past the force of fear that wants to be in charge of this human narrative, and help us align with the power of love, to, as Dr. Hawkins would say, the power of love that is our innate divine expression in this world. And so Mom's gone. Grace has landed fully in my heart and body by the name. Her name was Avis Grace. And this yurt, this space, was built after her passing, and I named it Grace, not just because it's part of her name, but it's the gift of life that she gave me, is this understanding of grace. And the storytellers will bring us home. And so that was like, okay, Mom, thanks so much. And so just to send it home, just live into the mythology of this moment. Trust the magic in our stories. The next afternoon, Friday afternoon, about 4:00, I get this clear audio moment, and she's like, I can just almost feel her. If I close my eyes, I can feel her sitting next to me, leaning in, going, "They forgot me in the morgue." Now, she's a hospital administrator, right? Nurse, administrator. That's the language she would have used. I had worked in the hospital for years. That's the language she says, "They forgot me in the morgue." And I was like, what, Mom? She goes, "They forgot me in the morgue. And it's Friday afternoon. I'm going to be stuck here all weekend." So I call the hospital and I asked to speak to the morgue. And sure enough, they forgot to call the Neptune Society to have them come pick her up. So I was like, okay, crash my car, big downloads, channel opens, and then the next day just sends it home that there is a there, that my mom is there, and there's a there. And so near-death experiences are invitations to listen at a different level, as Stephen Jenkinson says. This is the orphan wisdom that is waiting to be claimed, waiting to be nurtured and cherished in our human story. So there I was with this open channel, and every day for the next 2 years, I got downloads, sometimes an hour at a time, sometimes 4 hours at a time, and I recorded them. And this beautiful language, almost poetry, started coming through me. And I would get into these ecstatic writing spaces where I would write 40, 50 pages of poetry and um, and weep at the wording, not because it would be beautiful to anybody else, but because it was so beautiful to my heart. It just brought me so much peace and understanding. And one of the core questions that kind of spurred all of this: consent to the human experience, the 90-10 rule, the healing conversation, the Joji experiment, which I'll talk about, the Joji experience that I'm living into right now. All of it started with this one question: do I love myself enough to heal? If not, why not? Like, loving myself made sense, but it was the hardest thing I'd ever set my heart to. Like, I felt like I could love others, but I couldn't love myself. And I realized that I was living the pattern that I had learned as a child. And my own early childhood trauma had created this schism in me, this point of separation that was a reflection of the abandonment of my caregivers towards my well-being. And so I had learned abandonment very well, and I was living a life of self-abandonment. So the opposite of self-abandonment is consent, to fully consent to the human experience. So here's my question for you today. Do you love yourself enough to heal? If not, why not? Stay tuned. More to come soon.